So we're starting this series this month on the book of Ruth. And this story that we're about to hear is an old story. Even for the Bible, this is an old story. It goes back to the years before the kingdom was even a kingdom. So no King Saul, no King David yet. It goes to the years where Israel was a confederation of tribes living in Israel. And that confederation disintegrated into chaos and disorder. Now, Naomi, as the kids said, lived in Bethlehem. So okay, all of you who were in Sunday school, what does the name Bethlehem mean? Okay, it means Christmas. You remember from the Christmas story. But the name literally means something too. House of bread. So keep that in mind. Well, anyway, the house of bread. So when Carrie and I, we went to Bethlehem, and so the house of bread, these were the fields that once existed that it was terraced here, and they grew wheat out on these fields. And so it was known as, Bethlehem was kind of a breadbasket town, until it wasn't. There was a horrible famine. And here's how the story goes from our scriptures. During
the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man with his wife and 2 sons went to Bethlehem of Judah to dwell in the territory of Moab. The name of that man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrodites from the Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the territory of Moab and settled there.
So this really surprised me when I was in the Holy Land, that it is only about 25 miles from Bethlehem to Moab. When I heard that they journeyed to Moab, I was like, I imagined something kind of, hundreds of miles, a trek, and it's 25 miles. It's kind of like I said, it's kind of like moving out to Independence. But there is this matter that between those two places, there's a desert, the same desert that Jesus goes out and wanders in those 40 days and 40 nights. That's in between the two places. And the way that it works is that Bethlehem usually gets the rains, and Moab not so much. But for a few years, for a decade, the weather got weird. And Naomi and Elimelech moved. They became refugees, actually. They moved to Moab in a different nation. So I want to pause a little bit with the story on this one too, because when this story was first told, God was considered absolutely in charge of the weather. And so one of the big issues that the Israelites have is oftentimes God gets angry and the prophets say, well, you've gone and you worshiped other gods. Well, a lot of times the motivation is that if you were a farmer, you went out and you worshiped God, but you also made sure that you you kind of covered your bases. Because whatever God happened to be controlling the weather, you wanted that God to make sure that it rained, because no rain means no food. No food meant starving to death. So Naomi and Elimelech left Bethlehem.
But Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Then only she was left, along with her 2 sons. They took wives for themselves, Moabite women. The name of the first was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth. And they lived there for about 10 years. But both of the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. Only the woman was left, without her 2 children and without her husband.
Being a widow in the ancient world particularly was very dangerous. Again and again, you hear the religion of Jesus instructing people to care for the widow and the orphan. That phrase gets used over and over. The widow and the orphan. Because the concern of religion, of government, because they were one and the same back in those days, it was always to look out for to have concern for the poorest and the most powerful and most vulnerable people. And that was of paramount importance. And so Naomi, who had moved away from her extended family, from her protection, Her husband died, and even her sons died. Everything has gone wrong, and it's a complete mess. And so the question is, what's up with God in all of it?
Then Naomi rose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field of Moab, because while in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. She left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her.
We're going to get into the details of the daughters-in-law in the weeks to come. But of course, Ruth is the daughter-in-law that actually makes the move to Bethlehem. For now, what I want you to see is that you can hear it in what the writer just said. The perception is that God's attention had strayed from Bethlehem, but God's attention came back to the people of Bethlehem. Now, I'm going to guess that if you were living in Bethlehem during those years, there was more than one person who felt a little abandoned by God in a decade of drought and death.
So both of them went along until they arrived at Bethlehem. When they arrived at Bethlehem, the whole town was excited on account of them. And the women of the town asked, "Can this be Naomi?" She replied to them, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has returned me empty. Why would you call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has deemed me guilty?"
What could Ruth have possibly done to be deemed guilty? She did everything she could. She moved her family to try to keep them safe. What could she possibly have done for the penalty of death to be on her husband and sons? And what about them? They were not miraculously saved in this story. And so at the end of the chapter, Naomi has renamed herself Mara, which means bitter. And other than still breathing and having her daughter-in-law with her, Ruth, there's really not much positive to be seen in the story so far. And yet, the story of Ruth, the reason it is so beloved is because it is a story of redemption and hope, not just for Naomi, but for the nation of Israel as a whole. And it's a story about relationships and the choices that we make in relationships. And you have to acknowledge that at this point in the story, there are legitimate questions about God's relationship with Naomi. She's asking those questions. There are legitimate questions about God's relationship to humanity as a whole. And I was thinking about this last weekend. It was a Memorial Day weekend last weekend. And I was thinking, a lot of times on Memorial Day, I will break out my grandfather's memoirs from the Second World War. And there's a story about a mission that he flew in the Second World War. He flew in a troop carrier, and they were returning to base after a mission, and a squadron of U.S. fighters was leaving the same base. The fighters mistook the cargo planes as German bombers and began to shoot them down. The pilots and the flight crews all had to return to the same base that night and be with each other after this horrible friendly fire incident. This was the lowest spot in the war for my grandfather. He said that he was a person his entire life, he was a person who was strong in faith in God. But after this mission, he realized that no amount of faith, no amount of good decisions or good works or righteous acts could offer any protection against death. No amount of prayer could keep tragedy away. He said this was the point in the war that from this moment, he assumed that he was going to die in the war. The way that he would put it to me is he said, from that moment on for the rest of the war, I was a dead man walking. God didn't spare my mom, his daughter, from pain and death to cancer. And even though we have a cross, we put a cross in front of our religious places, there's still this question about why God allows bitter suffering in the world, even when it's literally right in front of our faces every Sunday. So what do you do with all that? What does it mean to be in a relationship with God who allows so much pain and suffering to happen? Because you know it. There can be, in my way of thinking, people do have answers, and I've had people give me answers. But in my world, I'm going to be honest with you, I've never had a completely satisfactory answer to why. Why, when you experience, particularly when you've experienced so much pain, as to why God allows it. And I've heard people answer, people have said things like, well, it allows people to have free will. Okay, that works for you, good. Or it tests us and it helps us to grow. And that's true. You know, to an extent, things that happen have consequences in our lives. You teach that to your kids. But sometimes things happen and you just didn't deserve it. It wasn't a consequence. And so I'm going to be honest, I can only speak for myself, but I've never found those answers to be particularly helpful, even if I've seen some amount of truth in them. For me, the only way I've been able to understand this truly, for myself, is relationally. Jesus described his relationship with God using family terms. God is a loving parent. That's how Jesus would describe his relationship with God. And his followers continued that. His church followed that as referring to Jesus as God's son. And then they even expanded the idea and said that all people are children of God. And so when we hear Jesus cry from the cross out to God like this,
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you left me?
When we hear that, when we hear Jesus, we hear that sense of abandonment. That even one person who understood God's nature far more than I ever will, even he could cry out and feel abandoned. And so I have to look at all of this through relationships. It's the only way I can understand it. And there was a story that was once told to me by the Reverend Tex Sample, and some of you know Tex. Take a look.
Peter Batacci was professor of philosophy at Boston University. In one of his classes, he had a young woman who was terribly paralyzed in both arms. In fact, she had so little use of those arms that about the only thing she could do was use these two fingers. And when she would come to class, she would get a pen in those fingers, bend way over her desk, and then write furiously. Bertacci was just a machine gun of ideas. And so in his lectures, she had to work very hard to keep up and to write fast enough. It was quite apparent to Bertacci that at times she was in no little pain. One day, she was leaving class, and Bertacci said, "Could I talk to you for just a moment?" She stayed, and he said, "You know, you're going through a lot to be here. You not only work hard, it's obvious you're in pain. What's your story? Tell me about the arms." She said, "Well, I was one of those kids, there were a great many of us that had polio. And I did the iron lung thing, the big hospital and all that. And when I began to get better and got out of the iron lung, they told They told my mother that I could actually go home, but that somebody had to do the therapy. And that it's probably better for them to do it at the hospital because it's painful and because I would resent it. My mother said, "Can I do it?" They said, "Yes, we can teach you, but she won't like it and she will resist it mightily." And my mother said, "Teach me." So my mother learned to do the therapy and took me home. The first day there, she took me to my room, pulled down the windows, closed the door, and started to rub. My God, Dr. Bertocci, that hurt. At first, I just began to beg her to stop. "Please, Mother, please don't do this. Please stop." And that didn't work. My mother just kept on rubbing. Then I began to cry. I mean, I bawled, I wailed, and I begged my mother, "Please, please stop. Don't do this anymore. It hurts, it hurts." And my mother kept on rubbing. When that didn't work, I began to cuss her. And I called her every name I knew. In fact, Dr. Bertocci, I made up some names. But my mother kept on rubbing. When she finished, my mother would leave my room, go into her room, close the door, and cry. Dr. Bertocci, that went on every day for a year. Bertocci was, of course, touched and looked down at the floor. And when he did, the young woman said, "But Dr. Bertocci."
The mom, God, is not dispassionate. She cried. I hear the story and I imagine my own kids, and if I were in a situation where I had to do that, I would. But to do that every day for a year would wound my soul. She hurt and she suffered with her daughter. And this is how I have come to understand God's relationship to me when I have lost something that I cannot replace. This is how, even though I know that God is sometimes silent in your life and you don't feel that presence as strongly, that I have trusted that God is not callous or unfeeling or unloving. That when God was silent, Jesus cried out. And the story is that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook, the rocks split. In the ancient world, when death came, the loved ones of the deceased would rip their clothes in agony, just as their hearts were ripped in two. In anguish, God was no different. God tore the temple veil in two in anguish. God wept through groanings which were indistinguishable from earthquakes. You and I, we will experience pain and loss. That's inevitable. But even so, God is not above suffering with you. And neither is any one of us in this place. We go together with the power to heal. Will you stand now and join me in praying in song? Please stand.